Great pleasure to have you all here tonight. Thank you for coming out in the cold. And it's wonderful to be launching this important book in a rain of dust at Love Books this evening. It is, of course, the extraordinary story of how a young British lawyer, Richard Meeran, who is sitting right here, fought and won a landmark legal battle against Cape plc, a multinational corporation responsible for the devastating impact of asbestos mining in South Africa. Not only did he win this battle, but this case, importantly, has had a wider global impact on the evolution of corporate accountability. So congratulations to you both on the publication of In a Rain of Dust, and welcome to Love Books. It's really lovely to have you both here tonight, winging it along here between the two of you. I'll just tell you a little bit about David and Richard. David Kinley, who is the author of the book, is the Chair of Human Rights Law at the University of Sydney, a founding member of Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, and an expert member of Doughty Street Chambers in London. He's the author of a number of other books, including The Liberty Paradox, Living with the Responsibilities of Freedom. Richard Meeran, the subject of this book, is a pioneer in multinational human rights litigation. Sorry, that's a legal term, isn't it? Yeah. Forgive me. He has led groundbreaking cases against UK parent companies on behalf of South African victims of asbestos exposure and mercury poisoning, achieving 2 landmark jurisdiction rulings in the UK House of Lords. His work has since spanned environmental, human rights, and corporate accountability cases across Africa, South America, and beyond. And in 2024, Richard was appointed a UN legal expert for the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. It's fabulous to have you both here tonight, and over to the two of you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see so many people here. We've had quite a hectic week, actually, first in Cape Town, and then we went to Prieska, but we're having to wing it a bit today because we were meant to have a moderator who is unfortunately unwell, and so we're trying to figure out how we should present this talk. So what we've decided we'll try and do is to ask each other the questions that the moderator might have asked us. David, if I can start.
Yes, Richard.
What prompted you to write this book, and how much did I pay you to do it?
Well, you did, Richard, actually. You didn't pay me very much. I think it's I didn't know about the background to the case, but I knew the case. And the case is one that is celebrated within law schools. It's taught precisely because it was groundbreaking on a number of very important corporate and human rights legal arenas, and we may or may not get into that here. But when I asked Richard about the background to the case and the sorts of things that he was exposed to, involved in, what he saw, what he thought, how he overcame the huge obstacles, intellectual, legal, financial, evidentiary, distance. He's in London. All of this stuff happened in the Northern Cape in Limpopo. It had the makings of a sort of movie in my head. I'm not a movie writer, but I'd like to think I can write books. And so I was intrigued by the whole patchwork of sadness, of destruction, of agony, but also of hope, of fighting for justice, of the desire to win and to make a company that had created such devastation responsible, even if the odds were almost impossible, as indeed Richard was told was the case legally. And certainly many of the people in Prieska and in Polokwane and around the eastern part of Limpopo never thought that they had any chance of being able to bring Cape Industries, a British corporation that had mined asbestos in South Africa for decades and decades ago, never thought that they could ever match them in terms of legal arguments, let alone politics or finance. So it was the makings of an amazing story, one that is not just about despair and destruction and death and disease though it is that. But it's also about cover-up, it's about corporate greed, but also about the fight to expose those things in a way that would not just have an impact on the individual claimants, 7,500 of them, but also to all of them that they are surrounded by, their communities, their family, and people following them, not just asbestos victims, but other victims of corporate skullduggery. So it spoke to me on all those levels. The real challenge was then, my God, that sounds like a huge jigsaw to put together, and it was. But I've got to say, it was fun. It was like a jigsaw. You put one piece in, you think, oh, great, okay, I've got another piece, I can keep going, and finally, you have the whole thing. Or maybe I have not achieved the whole thing, but I felt that I had done as much as I could, and so it was that really, really drove me. Finally, I should just say that Richard, when I started to ask him about the case, was extraordinarily generous, but also magpie-like in his memories of the case. I mean, it's 25 years ago. He brought up huge numbers of interesting legal, political, cultural facts, medical facts that he and then I had to learn, but also fun and crazy, bizarre moments which are peppered in the book. Even the Latin inscription in the book is, in light, in darkness there is always light. And many of the people that we talk to would emphasize that as well, even though they've gone through what for many of us would be considered hell. And that is itself inspiring. But really, down to you, Richard. You gave so much. I've probably got about 200, maybe 250 hours of transcript of his mutterings and pontifications. They were fantastic. The stories that he told were tremendous, and I did my best to weave them all into the story. So, yeah, that's what drove me to do it.
I mean, you're assuming that what I told you was true. I mean, at my age, my memory is beginning to fade. When I started this case, I had hair. I think you did as well.
I did
when you started. I don't know how many people know about the asbestos issue. So maybe it would be useful just to give you a bit of background, and also background to how the case came about. I was contacted in the early 90s, or maybe about 1994, by the National Union of Mine Workers in the UK about the asbestos epidemic in South Africa that was particularly affecting communities living in the Northern Cape, where they mined blue asbestos, and in Limpopo, where they mined brown asbestos. These are the two most lethal forms of asbestos. And the company concerned, Cape plc, was a British company which was headquartered in London but had operations in South Africa mining and milling asbestos. And they'd operated for, I think, almost 100 years, but in conditions that would not have been tolerated, certainly in the UK, Europe, or the US, exposing workers to astronomical levels of dust without protection, employing women and young children in very hazardous tasks without any protection, and causing enormous environmental contamination as well. And of course, all the workers, the mine workers, were black and coloured as they used to be designated. But a lot of the people that lived in the town where the mill was were white people. And so this was something that affected everyone, regardless of ethnicity or race. And there were huge levels of asbestos-related disease, and the company had been able to operate with impunity. And that's because of regulators or mining inspectors who really weren't interested in enforcing the regulations, Probably they lacked resources, but also the inclination, because many of them would have wanted to work in the industry. And because it would have been impossible for the victims to have obtained access to justice, to have been able to take legal action against the company. And so this just carried on, and actually, the whole industry worldwide was driven by the demand of consumers in Europe and the US. That's what created the demand for the mining and milling of asbestos in South Africa. And it finally ended when the risks associated with asbestos became well known to the public in the US and Europe. The demand then dried up and the mining then stopped, not because of fear for the well-being of black miners, but because of European and American consumers. So that's the backdrop to it, and that's why I was asked to get involved in it. And yeah, it was a challenging assignment at that stage, because the law hadn't. It was a novel case. The law hadn't developed either in terms of the possibility of being able to hold the company accountable in the English courts, or to be able to hold the parent company, which was the English company, responsible. The problem was the South African subsidiary companies, which had been operating the mines and the mills, were insolvent and uninsured. So it wasn't possible to take any action against them. So it was quite a challenging assignment. But just about the book, we went to Prieska, as David said, which was really the focal point of the blue asbestos mining activities. We went there just a couple of days ago. We were there yesterday and the day before to meet the communities. And I remember when we first went there, and one of my colleagues, Zanele, is sitting at the back there. She's mentioned in the book as well. A lot. And she spent a lot of time in Prieska, but whenever we went to visit the communities, which was quite regular, we would find that people who had been there on the previous occasion were no longer there because they died of asbestos-related disease. These were really incredible communities. They, despite all the suffering, were very dignified and unified, and the meetings we held with them were just incredible. But going there this week, which was 22 years after the case finished, there was no one there from those times. And that reflects the impact of this very tragic illness. Mesothelioma, by the way, which is a cancer of the lining of the lung, which is uniquely associated, particularly with blue asbestos exposure. And so there was no one there from the past. Well, I think we met one person, actually, but the rest were gone. But the other thing about why the book is so important is because neither do the young people who are there know about the history of what happened. They don't know about it, there's no record of it. And that's why this book was so important, David, was so that people and that community have a record of what happened, the way this company behaved towards the community, despite knowing fully about the risks. And just knowing how their struggle for justice, whilst it had a result which you would describe as mixed, it showed that they were not powerless, and I thought that was really important. So I'm really grateful to you for doing that, for producing the book, because you wrote it in a way that I wouldn't have been able to. I mean, the way you have explained things, I think, is very intelligible to everyone, whether they're just lawyers, doctors, or people without that expertise. And I think you did an amazing job just getting to grips with everything.
Can I ask a quick contextual question? Yeah. Are asbestos mines deep, extensive things like gold mines or the open cast or
Open cast.
Surface.
The surface.
Often they're just to dig into the hole, into the hill, and it's 10, 20 feet, not much bigger than a human being, mined by 1 or 2 or 3 people, just digging asbestos straight out of the hills. So none of them were deep. Some, occasionally there was one in Kigus, which is a bit deeper, but most of them were called adits, just directly into the hills. And therefore there are hundreds of them. And many of them...
Are they big mines?
No, not particularly. They might be the size of this room. So we're not talking about big mines.
Except Kukas
Kukas
was the world's biggest blue asbestos mine. The only other blue asbestos mining took place in Wittenoom in Western Australia. And the Penge mine, Penge, which was named after Penge in Kent or Middlesex.
London,
Penge in England, anyway, was the world's largest brown asbestos amosite mine.
I'm going to ask you a question.
No, I've been speaking enough, I think. But can I ask you a question just about your research and this? I mean, you explain very clearly the issue of concealment of knowledge of the risks of mesothelioma, particularly, and what happened around that, the way in which the medical establishment was pressurized by the industry. I think that's quite an interesting topic.
Yeah, I mean, and this is really where law, politics, and commerce intersect, because what Richard was trying to do was to establish that CAPE had been negligent in its behaviour towards the employees and indeed the communities around the asbestos mines in South Africa. And in order to demonstrate that, I won't go into the legal niceties, but he has to demonstrate that they knew of the dangers of what it is that their product produced, what it yielded. And they were very careful to conceal any evidence of them knowing the medical evidence that showed that it was deadly to human beings. And indeed, they pressured South African and worldwide, but particularly South African medics and academics and occupational health specialists to water down or muddy or question their findings. Now, not all of these occupational health and medics yielded, of course, but some did, and some find themselves being on the, not so much the payroll, but their research being paid for by the asbestos industry. So, ironically, the most important medical revelation about blue asbestos and its unique singular association with mesothelioma was produced by 3 South African doctors. And that document that was published in 1960 in the British Journal of International Occupational Industrial Health, okay, that's not quite the right name, but that has become the most quoted occupational health journal article that's ever been produced. It's a remarkable achievement. But Chris Wagner, who was the lead, he was one of 3 authors of that, was effectively heavied and bullied out of his position at the National Institute of Occupational Health, where we've just been, down in Constitutional Hill. And he took a job in the United Kingdom, in Wales, and actually he ended up saying that actually there's no clear link between mesothelioma. So the heavy bullying tactics of the asbestos companies were extraordinarily overt. They weren't just subtle. And today we were in the National Institute, which is a very important part of this story. And when I started to research the book, I knew there was one 4-page document that was critical to Richard's case, demonstrating that CAPE knew of the dangers. And that document had been produced by the pneumoconiosis research unit within the National Institute by its then head, Ian Webster. And when I went to the National Institute 2.5 years ago to start the research, the archivist and I could not find that document, even though that document came from the National Institute. I knew it existed because it had been tabled, it had been tendered in court by Richard, who had got it by other means. So it did exist. We couldn't find it. And things like the record of who visited the National Institute during the 60s and 70s demonstrated or revealed so many members of the asbestos industry, including Cape, visiting because they were paying for a lot of this research, that one has to say this, might jump to the conclusion that it was removed. But it certainly was not there. So one of the things that we were able at least to do in reparation, a tiny element of reparation, was to get a copy of that document and then give it to the National Institute. So they now have it. So it's now there. So things like that show the willingness of, particularly of the asbestos industry in South Africa, to be so brutal in covering up what it knew. And I think a lot of that has got to do with the fact that it was happening in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and apartheid politics really allowed that. It was an accommodating environment. Even the mines inspectorate reports are astonishing in the clean bill of health that they give to the mines that they visit in these communities that yielded so many mesotheliomas. It's beyond doubt that they are covering up what was actually on the ground.
And interestingly, that document that David's just referring to from the pneumoconiosis research unit, in which they decided to rename the mesothelioma survey, a survey into dust, because they were worried about the stigma. They said, that's what they said, we're worried about the stigma that this will create and the threat that this will pose to future employment on our mines. This document was uncovered by an investigative journalist called Laurie Flynn, who provided a lot of research for the case. And many years later, I went with Laurie to the archive of a lawyer in Bloomington, Illinois, into his basement. He had an archive of documents that had been discovered in US litigation that he'd brought for American claimants who had suffered from asbestos-related diseases. And he had 85 boxes of documents that we spent a week going through, Laurie and I, in the basement of this freezing basement in Bloomington. And in these boxes included bits of decaying blue asbestos rope, letters from people who'd written to the mine asking them for asbestos because they wanted some blue rock. But most memorably was a series of letters between Cape and an advertising company where, because of the increasing publicity around the risks associated with asbestos in the United States, what the industry wanted to do was to counter that by highlighting the benefits of asbestos. So they came up with this idea of a children's book, which was called the Asbestos Family Hero Album. And it would have characters like Smokey the Bear and Asbestos Man.
And Asbestos Woman.
And Asbestos Woman. So these were the kind of levels that they would stoop to. If you looked at their brochures as well, they seem to indicate that the company felt this asbestos had some kind of almost religious significance. But what I wanted to say as well, having mentioned Laurie Flynn, a journalist, is the importance in a case like this, where you have a very powerful opponent, well-resourced opponent with big law firms representing them, the ability to pay for the best experts, lots of resources. It's really important on the other side to be able to obtained support from a variety of organisations. The NIOH, which was where I first went when I heard about the case, and I met Professor Tony Davies, Dr. Marianne Felix, and they really educated us about asbestos. And they were really incredible, like all the doctors actually who I've come across at the NIOH, incredible people who are not only excellent doctors and scientists, but very committed to the cause of worker health and protection. Their role was invaluable in providing us with information and research and just educating us on the subject matter. And then, of course, we had others who supported us. The National Union of Mine Workers played a really important role in the case, the South African NUM. And civil society. We had Action for Southern Africa, which was the successor to the anti-apartheid movement in the UK, were campaigning very strongly on the case alongside other organisations like Amnesty International. And this was really important to raise the profile of the case, to attract public attention, to put pressure on the company. And ultimately, when the case got to the highest court, which is now called the Supreme Court in the UK, but it used to be the House of Lords, the South African government intervened in the case on our side, which I think is pretty unusual and was really important because it elevated the status of the case above some of the personal attacks that the company was making, which I think is quite typical of corporate strategy in cases like this. But that kind of strategy, corporate strategy, really didn't wash when you had these organisations and the government getting involved in the case.
I think one of the most interesting things for me researching the book is just the breadth of affairs you have to get involved in as a lawyer. You can't just be a lawyer. You've got to be a politician, a strategist. You've got to be an element of scientific knowledge. So you would have to draw on people to understand what the effect was and how that then was concealed. But you also have to do things that are left field. And this is one of the most interesting things of Richard. You've got to draw on every resource you can get. So for those of you who've got the book or have looked at it, you'll see in the middle of it there's a set of photographs. And they were taken by this man, Hein du Plessis. And Hein was then also, he had more hair and he was younger. But Hein and Richard met in a Kimberley bar. I described this in the book. And Hein had been taking photographs, I think, of Prishka people, maybe just of old people. I can't remember exactly the elements of it. But Richard was intrigued by these photographs. He said, what about taking photographs of the victims and of the protests in Prishka, which he did. And then those became the source of a worldwide exposure, exhibitions of these extraordinary photographs of these people. And that when you look in the book, you'll see them. And they are striking, so striking that we asked Hein, can we put them in the book? And we've got them in the book. But things like that, Richard had to get his head around. He also had to become quite au fait with the media. I mean, it's something that would be on his side. He's got a great story to tell. The other side, corporates, well, it's less of a great story, is it? So you had to really exercise that. But also he did things that I just think were fantastic. He never has confirmed to me that he did this, but somebody else has. And that was that during or immediately before the delivery, the oral delivery of the House of Lords case, the judgment by the court, which was very short, he was sitting with an activist, an NUM activist, Thabo, who I interviewed, who told me that at that point Richard sort of got up just before the delivery and disappeared. And he thought, oh, well, he's gone to the loo or something. But he disappeared and wasn't even there when the oral delivery was made. And so Thabo lost sort of contact with, just walked out with everyone else, and it was a favourable judgment to Richard. And there was Richard standing outside, who came running up to him and said, "So what happened?" And Thabo's going, "Well, you know what's happened. Why are you doing this?" And of course he was doing it for the theatre of the media, who were all there, and they're listening, and Thabo says, "Well, we won." And so Richard then wraps his arms around Thabo, and Thabo's going, "Oh yeah, okay, but the media, of course, lap it up, and that, that sort of thinking is way beyond what I would be involved in. But Richard could see that bit of theatre would work.
Sounds a bit devious. Really.
Yeah, well, devious, okay. But there were, as I say, lighter moments, but also just showing the commitment that Richard had to put into this. I mean, a commitment that didn't always serve him well with his colleagues. Like, again, in the book, I describe a moment when they were in settlement negotiations, and he's got his colleagues around him from his law firm and others, and they're sitting in a room just across from where the opposition lawyers are sitting, negotiating amongst themselves, right, what are we going to pitch to them next? And then every so often they come together, pitch their ideas, disagree and agree on certain things, and go back into their enclaves to debate. But Richard is so committed to this, so this is what his lawyers, his colleagues tell me, that he forgot to order in any food or drink. Meanwhile, they can see through the corridor into the other room where these extremely well-heeled London lawyers have got sort of banquets being shipped in on a regular basis, and these poor, relatively poorly paid lawyers are suffering. And eventually somebody says, "Richard, we would like some food." And so he gets into. But that sort of commitment to the cause, that's one element of it, is a real feature of the book. I'm obviously telling something that's rather amusing, but it's clearly what drove him to orchestrate the full panoply of people that were engaged in winning the case. And maybe on that, can I just ask you then? You've said, and I say in the book as well, that it was a whole orchestra of people. I mean, you were the conductor, whether you like being called that or not, but it really did rely on a lot of other people in order to achieve the result, didn't it?
Yeah, it certainly did. Apart from all the organisations that I've mentioned, civil society, trade unions, government, and so on, medical experts, we had a very large team, and it was an incredible team spirit. Everyone was, very motivated, and I think quite different from perhaps being in a large commercial firm if you're representing a defendant, and undoubtedly it's very formidable when you have a big commercial firm on the other side with their resources, and they have very well-trained lawyers. And you on your side, you don't have the same kind of resources, but you have excellent lawyers and paralegals and so on, and people who are really highly motivated and want to get justice for the client. So they're absolutely vital. The team, it's a team effort, these things. It's not certainly not one person. It's a whole panoply of organisations and individuals. I just wanted to mention this is a bit completely different topic. There's something that occurred to me that might be of interest. I know that there's an anthropologist here and maybe a sociologist as well. Just from the Priska visit, that when I first went there, we had our links through the NIOH were actually with people from the white community. And there's an amusing story that you tell in the book about the meeting that I had with the doctor's wife, Dr. Pickard. Dr. Pickard was the local doctor who had identified all these mesothelioma cases in the town. But when we had the first meeting, it was in the church, which still is the one that the white members of the community attend. so we had this meeting, and there weren't only white people in the meeting. There were black people in the meeting as well. And what was very noticeable is that at the end of the meeting, when we started speaking to people, that the black people were at the back, even though some of them had been there at the start. And so we made a point of saying, no, we want to see people in the order that they came. But when we left the church, there were two people who asked us whether we could go to their community, which was the coloured community in a place called Omega Hall. And so we went there the next day, and there were hundreds and hundreds of people at this meeting, all clutching these small certificates confirming that they had pneumoconiosis or family members of people who had died of mesothelioma. There were literally hundreds of them. It was just mind-blowing. After that meeting, we said that in future we're not going to have meetings in different places, and we made the excuse. Well, I made the excuse, and they couldn't say that, but I said, "Look, we're from the UK, and we don't have separate meetings for people along racial lines. Everyone must come to the same meeting." And so we said we'd have the meetings in the different places, but there was one meeting that everyone had to come to. And our impression, I think, was at the time during the case that because this was something that affected people, everyone, it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is, that they had a kind of a common enemy, and it did seem to bring the community together. And I wondered when we went there 2 days ago, I didn't really wonder actually, I hoped, but I wasn't surprised by what I saw. I wondered whether that might have continued. And I think it's quite obvious that it hasn't. That the community there is as divided as ever. And, that's a bit of a depressing story, actually, isn't it?
Well, okay, there's one that I don't think is quite as depressing, but it's unexpected, and that is, again, something that I learned in writing the book, and that is emphasize the human stories rather than the law. The law will come behind it, and if those are interested in it, they dig deeper. And one of the things that Richard and his colleagues at the time orchestrated was to bring over some people from Prishka, from the community, who all speak Afrikaans, and English therefore is not at all natural to them, to the House of Lords, to the political part of the House of Lords as opposed to the legal part. Won't go into the details of that, but to present at a meeting above the main chamber of the House of Lords to invited members, ladies and lords of the chamber, 50 or so of them. And Richard suggested that one, Audrey, who is still alive, and we saw yesterday, would stand up and simply tell her story. And she's an extremely demure, quiet, very gentle woman. And it must have been nerve-wracking because it's not her language. And Richard just said, just tell your stories. Stand up and tell it in however way you want to take your time. And they were all sitting there, including Thabo, who told me the story about Richard running out. Watching this, they're all seasoned lawyers and politicians. She's not at all. She stands up and tells her story, and she told me when I interviewed her 2 years ago that the most astonishing thing was that after she finished was to look up and see many of these nearly all white people in front of her, lords and ladies, crying. And she just couldn't understand how could I have achieved that, or how have my words yielded that result. But that became such a sort of important point to hammer home what really is happening to these people. And it's not a law or political point at all. It was a sort of natural one, human story. And I think it's those things that really made the case, and those things that attracted me. to the book, to put them in the book rather than just sort of focusing on the law. Even though I'm a law professor, the law plays a small part in the book.
Yeah.
I don't know if Kate is here. Do people want? Shall we open it up a little bit to questions?
Want to have a discussion.
People, and we've only got the microphone, so if you can speak loudly, no, you can speak loudly enough from there. I think you can.
Zanella and myself had a discussion about the importance of public awareness, and does that play a role in the outcome of a case like this? Or is the law and public opinion and awareness of what happens, are they so separate that the one does not influence the other?
It had a major role in this case, and I think, before the case had been launched, understanding and awareness of what had happened in South Africa was probably fairly limited. The case did attract increasing publicity, and that in turn led to politicians wanting to get involved. The provincial government was very supportive of the case, and one of the reasons for that, and I think they were quite honest about it as well, is that they had elections coming. They wanted to show their support for the community because it meant that they were more likely to win the election. And I think that's, at first I thought, wow, that's a bit cynical, but actually I don't, in a way. When you think about it, that's what they're there for. And if they do actually support the community, then they deserve to get the support of the community. So, and when it came to the South African government, the case had attracted so much publicity that I think the government was quite willing to get involved in it. And the other thing, of course, was that the company was no longer investing in South Africa. If it had still been a major investor here and employing people on the mines, it might have been a different story. It's easy, in a way, when you haven't got that pressure from the other side. And actually, from a technical perspective, it was important because before we got to the House of Lords, one of the reasons we had been defeated and why the court had said that the case couldn't proceed in England was on the basis that the public interest of the case in South Africa was greater than the UK public interest. And in their intervention, the South African government said, no, hang on, this is a UK company that orchestrated its business from the UK. The profits went back there. The government, the legal, the courts of South Africa do not have the resources to deal with all the wrongs of apartheid. And so actually the public interest of South Africa is in the case being heard in England. So that was, just from a technical point of view, important.
The public awareness, I think, is crucial now as well, moving on, because we found one of the things that struck me over the last few days is with the communities in Polokwane, with the National Institute today, with the Prishka community yesterday, is that many of those who are probably 40 and younger, but certainly those who are 25 and younger, really, a lot of this is just like ancient history. And they saw the book as a way to maybe investigate and understand what had happened to their families, to their forebears. I was really quite moved by that. They would clutch onto the book and say, this is our story. They're only part of it. And there was one young woman who was introducing us, or at least introduced the book at Prishka. She's a first-year commerce student, university student. And at the end, I gave her a book, and at the end she came up to me and she said, could I write a poem about the book? I thought, it was just so moving. I said, well, you don't need my permission, but yes, please. And so she obviously just wanted to know about what had happened and what sort of emotions would be brought up in her, anticipating, having listened to us, as to what they might be. And indeed, in the National Institute today, the occupational health people there were saying, well, what can we do to raise public awareness about the continuing issue of asbestos? It's throughout Johannesburg, it's throughout Sydney, it's throughout the world, it's in all sorts of buildings. So how do we keep people aware of this? And it is so much an out of sight, out of mind. I mean, if you took me a long time to get my head around all of this, but the medical and physical dimensions of asbestos dust are extraordinary. Certainly to me as a non-medic, I spent a chapter looking at this. It's so minute, it's so indescribably small that you really don't think that it's dangerous. And so when we're kicking around yesterday on the old mill site in Prishka with blue asbestos on the ground, we can't see anything in the air, but I'm sure it was there. So these sorts of movements towards understanding what asbestos legacy is are of continuing importance. Other questions? Well, how do we do this? You, sir.
Thank you. I had very quickly 3 related questions having to do with the law, and it has to do with jurisdiction, remedy, and scale. And so jurisdiction, just started responding to this, is that when you were bringing this case, part of the issue, I presume, is that the legal capacity in South Africa didn't exist to bring a case like this. And perhaps the capacity of the common law to hear the case like this didn't exist. But over the last 20 years, potentially that's changed. So as you think moving forward about where to bring cases like these, how do you think about those kinds of issues? The remedy question is, how does one actually implement remedies for this? And my understanding is that with both asbestos and gold, trusts have been a major mechanism. And some of the earlier trusts that had smaller scale settlements were very successful, but the latest trust around the silicosis gold case is much more complicated because of the scale of the settlement. So how do you think about effective enforcement of remedies going forward? And then the kind of scale issue is that, of course, multinational corporations are able to do the same thing across different places very easily, but it's much harder to kind of think about coordinated legal response across place. And in a small way, I teach in Chicago, and in a small way I'm trying to bring together a small group of South African lawyers with Colombian lawyers who are both litigating against mining companies. And the problems are the same in both countries, but the legal systems are very different. And so to actually translate skills and strategies across places is quite a big challenge. And so if one thinks of, this is a very local story in particular places in the Northern Cape and Polokwane, but it's also a global story. And how do you think about the kind of work of the law in kind of globalizing the kinds of strategies?
Just first of all, on the issue of jurisdiction, I think the starting point for me is that ideally cases should be brought in the courts of the places where people are, where claimants are. That's the ideal scenario. The case against Cape plc was brought in England for, I think, the following reasons. First of all, it was a British company, and it's quite normal to sue a company in its domicile. Secondly, as I said, its business was orchestrated from England and its profits went back there. But most importantly, at the time, and it wasn't because the South African lawyers don't have the ability. Certainly, my experience has always been that South African lawyers are just as capable as lawyers anywhere else, including in the UK. They have some fantastic lawyers here, especially public interest lawyers. but it's more a problem of resources. And as I mentioned earlier, to bring a case of this scale and complexity, you not only need good lawyers, you need resources, a lot of resources. And that was really the problem, and that was the reason why the case was allowed to proceed in England, because the court ultimately accepted that the legal aid system in South Africa had collapsed at that point in time, so there was no public funding available. Obviously, the victims couldn't afford to pay lawyers, and the case was so big and risky that it wouldn't have been feasible at that time for the lawyers who would have the inclination to do this type of case in South Africa to take on that risk, a risk of that magnitude. Commercial lawyers could have done it, but commercial lawyers represent industry and mining companies. They would be conflicted. They wouldn't touch a case like this. But the lawyers that could wouldn't have been able to do it in practice, and that was the reason. The second point was just about what's happening in other places in the world, and the same issues arising. That's certainly true. The decisions that are made in the courts of one country, like the decision of the House of Lords in the Cape PLC case, but I think I mentioned, or did I mention it earlier, that since that decision, through a process of strategic litigation, the law on the liability of parent companies of multinational companies has been developed, at least in the English courts. And that then has a knock-on effect, not just in England, but the courts of other countries take notice of those decisions, other common law countries certainly, but not just common law countries. Under the Constitution in South Africa, the South African courts are obliged to take notice of the decisions of other courts. So it does have this knock-on effect. And even in civil law jurisdictions, they won't ignore cases like this, like in Colombia and Brazil and so on. So it does certainly have that knock-on benefit. And at the same time as this has been happening, there has been the development of the whole field of business and human rights. And these cases have been integral to that process. But nowadays, businesses are obliged to, there are standards and guidelines and so on which oblige business to take into account the adverse human rights and environmental impact that they have on communities and workers and so on. And their investors expect them to do that. Now, a lot of them make very bold statements, and it might be that they're paying lip service to these principles, but the world has changed a lot since those days, and I think it's much more difficult for many companies to behave in this way nowadays.
The scrutiny is much greater. They can't hide things in the way they used to be able to. I'm sorry, madam.
And I just wanted to congratulate you both on this incredible story, which is almost identical to something that's going on in South Africa now, which is the fight against sugary beverages. And in fact, there is no agreement that any of these companies will do their bit, and in fact, their shareholders don't hold it. So I could have, much of what you said about the reaction of this David-and-Goliath battle is very cogent to many situations, not just in South Africa, but across the globe, including cigarettes, nicotine, tobacco, and sugar.
Sugar, yeah.
Now, an addictive substance. And so I think that this book is very, very important because it allows other groups who are going through the same experience, almost identical, I have to say. And the issue around the public domain and engagement of the public is really critical. So I particularly want to congratulate
legal until the last 3 years of the case, the legal aid fund in the UK funded it. So at that time, we were able to obtain legal aid funding even for foreign claimants, which South African claimants were obviously foreign claimants. That wasn't without its criticism from the likes of the Daily Mail and other sectors in Britain. We did get quite seriously attacked for that. As we discovered when we received, I received a report from an anonymous donor about some PR consultants who had been instructed to devise a campaign against us, but particularly highlighting the award of legal aid to black miners, as it was said in the report. So, yeah, we had that benefit. I said until the last 3 years. What happened shortly towards the end of the case was that the company informed the legal aid board that they had enough money to fight the case, but if we succeeded at trial, they wouldn't have any money left. So they offered to give us a small, paltry sum to settle the cases. And when we refused to accept that, the legal aid fund, which obviously is responsible to the taxpayer, then withdrew the funding. So we had the last 3 years without any funding at all, actually. Yeah.
That reputational hit job that Richard was talking about, that was one of those gotcha moments. He gave me a copy of this brown envelope that somebody just deposited by hand at the reception of Lee Day, and it just said, "To the lawyer running the Cape case." And you open it up, and it is. It's a whistleblower who was obviously very close to this company that was doing the hit job on Richard. And it was very frank. It was an internal memo, really, saying, yeah, look, it really was saying things like, this would be great. We can just say to the Daily Mail, this is the British taxpayer paying all these black and coloured South Africans. What are we doing that for? It was brutal in its openness.
And it also said, it specifically referenced a story that had been on the Newsnight documentary about a white mesothelioma sufferer called Amanda Berger, and said, well, this wasn't very good to have a white asbestos sufferer. So this was all in their report.
It was one of those great moments. Also, I think just about when Richard was talking, it reminded me of another moment that I thought was so important, and I know he does too, and that is that at one stage in the settlement, there was a change of management at Cape. But even they were seeing this as transactional. How can we get out of this with the least amount of money to pay for the settlement? But during that settlement time, Richard got to know this guy well, and he then came out to Prishka to meet the communities that his company was going to be giving money to. And there's no doubt from the way because I interviewed him as well as Richard, there's no doubt that he was affected by what he saw. It's the human stories again. And also, actually interesting, and I think this is very important, he also told me that his children said to him, Dad, you've got to be on the right side of history here. And that's right. You think, I don't want to be associated with you, Dad, if you're going to be on the wrong side of history. And these things are important, I think. That sort of human element is crucial, even to big, hard-hearted financiers. Were there other questions? Sorry, I'm having to do everything.
Just a brief question. Once an asbestos mine gets finished, do they have mine tailings that keep on infecting the community?
Well, that's exactly right. You see, because obviously the tailings, they've taken as much asbestos as they can out, but the tailings contain residue of asbestos, and that's still there. I document in the end of the book in the last chapter that there are still hundreds of mines all over South Africa, and a very few of them have been rehabilitated. And here is the big issue. That costs money, and a lot of money and a lot of effort to rehabilitate them to a state where they're no longer dangerous. And yet people are living in and around them. And at the moment, that's falling to the provincial and national governments. Now, you may think that that's unfair because they were not the ones, certainly the current governments were not the ones that perpetrated this terrible situation. But what do you do? You know, the Prishka people we were talking to, what do they do? They may wish to pursue the historical claims against corporations, but the fact is that in front of them, they've got to deal with the game. And the game is we've got to get the provincial governments to find money, even though there are plenty of demands on that purse, and the national government to rehabilitate, because this is a poison and a legacy that is continuing to yield.
I mean, these companies should be obliged to clean up and rehabilitate when they leave. That's what must happen in the future. But unfortunately, I mean, throughout Southern Africa, this is what mining companies do. They reap the profits, and on the backs of workers who are often mistreated and exploited, and then they just walk away and say it's no longer our responsibility.
And that's why you need lawyers to pursue, this is on film, isn't it? But to pursue the bastards. You know, you've got to do that. Kate, I know I can see lots of other hands, but what?
Okay, we can take some more.
Oh, goodness me. Well, there's 1, 2, 3.
Let's take 3.
1, 2, 3.
I just want to ask, to what extent is Ace Makashuli and his houses in the Free State, where presumably all the houses that got asbestos have deteriorated, and who would be liable for that? Because obviously all the houses, there's the case, all the houses that were built with asbestos fine as long as it doesn't start to deteriorate, but I'm sure in South Africa they have all started to deteriorate. Who would be responsible?
Responsible for?
For people falling ill from whatever it is you get from asbestos in all the houses that were built with asbestos in the Free State, for example.
Well, this is one of the issues, that the only compensation system that exists is for those who worked in the asbestos industry, not those who, this would be considered environmentally exposed. We've all been environmentally exposed, some much more so. There's no compensation for that. That's the harsh reality.
Yeah, it's a big problem. When we were in the NIOH today, we went to visit some people who are working on a project there to improve the standards of monitoring of asbestos levels for people who are involved in construction or demolition of buildings, because that's an important issue, health and safety issue. So that those kinds of projects are important, but it's a big problem here. But only if the material is disturbed.
So I can just ask, does South Africa have those standards
Well,
for construction? I know they do in the UK, but do they have them here?
I think they do, from what we were told.
For
Yeah.
new builds.
Well, for dealing with asbestos in houses, construction.
Well, you'll need to ask a South African lawyer, but I'm sure they do. From what we heard today, they do have standards. But
Madam, and then you, sir.
Thank you.
No, it's you.
Congratulations again. I think it's an amazing piece of work. History has such an important role to play. Sorry, my name is Mia Sakanda, and I'm an occupational medicine specialist. I love the tagline, the human stories behind the doors. I think that's absolutely fascinating. So this week I had the opportunity to lecture to our third-year medical students, and it intrigued me and amazed me how interested they were in these disparate laws in South Africa that govern occupational health and safety. So just as that to set the scene, my question is, these students in 10 years' time, I'm hoping they'll take up a role in public health. What change would you hope that they see? They read this book in 10 years' time. How do you hope that this book would have helped influence medical education, laws, or policies in big corporates?
Well, it's actually something that you mentioned earlier today, that, I mean, obviously their main role is as medical professionals, but they will obviously want to be mindful of the wider context in which they're operating and other possibilities. So if they see people who are not working in unsafe conditions, if they're aware of if they're examining in their clinic workers who are employed in unsafe conditions, then they would presumably liaise with their union if they're unionised and try and get the union to improve conditions in that place. They might write letters to the employer, and they might even refer people to lawyers who may be able to assist them. And I think one of the important things about litigation, all these cases, obviously your role as a lawyer when you're representing clients, your primary role is to assist them, to act in their best interest, to obtain compensation for them. But you also have a wider function, which is that the cases you bring will act as a deterrent to prevent future harm occurring. So hopefully if the company is subjected to sufficient financial and reputational pain from a legal case, it might think twice about doing that again and having to undergo that. That's certainly the deterrent and preventative role of litigation is important. And as medical professionals, sometimes cases are referred to us by medical professionals who are aware of an issue, a health risk that they've seen in patients or are aware of in the literature. So, being aware of other courses of action that people can take, not just to treat disease but to prevent it, is something that I think would be valuable.
You, sir, you've got the full stop question.
It's Luke Rowley from my business partner who's worked with you on the Cowboy case, Daniel Turner, on to an extent you've answered my question is why do you do it? You're an academic, hopefully educate people around human rights laws, various other laws. You're a commercial lawyer to an extent. I think you made that quite clear in the extent of understanding that you need funding, you need to understand how it works, otherwise the system falls apart. But what are you trying to achieve in the end? What's the eventual outcome that you're trying to achieve? Are you trying to achieve a curve that is where the center is more correct in terms of its behavior, that the left and the right of that curve doesn't behave the way it should be? I think you addressed that in terms of the threat of litigation, that people don't sort of behave the way they can without that threat that's out there. But what's the eventual outcome? What are you sort of dreaming of when you try to put that together?
Well, as I said, first and foremost, to get justice for the people we're representing, but secondly, to teach the company, the business, and other businesses that will watch what has happened, a salutary lesson that it doesn't pay to mistreat people or to mistreat the environment. I mean, it's quite straightforward.
I mean, and more generally for me, it is this. In fact, I hate doing it, but I wrote a book a few years ago, 10, 15 years ago, called Civilizing Globalization. That, to me, is it. To civilize. I mean, I often say this to my students. We could have a revolution. We could have a socialist republic. Marxism could take over. But that's not immediately going to happen, although maybe in the United States at the moment, maybe there are eyes towards that. But it's not. So therefore, we deal with what we've got. So you've got the sharp edges of capitalism, but capitalism can do good as well as bad. So let's cut off the corners, cut off the sharp edges. And you're sitting with students in a law school who are using iPads and the latest phones and dressed as they are, and they're benefiting from capitalism, but they must know also of those sharp edges, and they should. I'm trying, I hope, to educate them in a way that recognizes those sharp edges should be dulled. They should be taking action to that. If it's litigation, if it's acting as a in-house counsel, advising the board of management, what they should and shouldn't be doing, that's where I think they can play a valuable role. And they may be young and they may be inexperienced at the moment, but they will soon be our age. And during that career, they want to look back and think, you know, I did the right thing.
Thank you so much to both of you for such a wonderful conversation.